Robert Emmett, 1916 Society Listen Ski, met with Tommy McKearney, former Hungerstriker and veteran Republican, to chat about Liam Mellows, his politics, and where that fits in today to today's struggle.
So today, December 8th, is 100 years to the day since the Free State Government executed Liam Mellows, Joe McKelvey, Richard Barrett and Rory O'Connor. But today we're going to talk about Liam Mellows. So Liam Mellows came from a rather unusual background for an Irish Republican activist. Could you tell me more about his early years?
Liam Mellows, unusual to a certain extent, to the extent that his father was a British soldier, third generation soldier. His grandfather was a British soldier as well. In fact, Liam Mellows was born in England, just outside Manchester, son of a British soldier. Now, unusual to a certain extent, but not totally unusual, because keep in mind that Tom Clark's father was a British soldier, James Connolly himself was a British soldier, Tom Barry was a British soldier. Now, having said that, yes, it was unusual, but not totally uncommon, particularly at a time when Ireland was incredibly poor, and a lot of Irish people joined the British Army, not out of loyalty to the Crown, but simply for to have a
means of existence, I suppose.
Now, the first 3 years of his life he spent in England. Child, wouldn't have had a huge influence on him, but the great influence was his father, because he was reared the child of the British military, with all that would have meant. And keep in mind that it was stamped, ingrained into the children of the empire, of the army. But the significant thing was, at 3 years of age, when his father was reassigned to Ireland, at the time, keep in mind that the British Army would have been stationed all around the world, in every area of the empire. But 3 years after Liam Mellows was born, his father's regiment was reassigned to Ireland. But Liam Mellows then was sent to his grandparents in Wexford. They were a family called Jordans. His grandfather was a man called Pat Jordan. And it was in Wexford with the Jordans that it's believed that he started, as he grew older, to hear the stories of Wexford. Wexford at the time, bear in mind, was preparing for the centenary of the 1798 uprising.
Rebellion, yeah.
Yeah. And the county was alive with work to celebrate that. Mellows, it's believed, imbibed the stories of the rising of 1798 and the other Fenian movement, Land League, so on and so forth. But still, the influence of his father, as after a number of years he returned, the father settled and the family settled in Dublin, and his father brought young Mellows back to Dublin, and there he was sent to actually some of the what would have been military schools, or the schools run by the military for the children of the military. So in many ways he was given the upbringing of a British military child, and it's often believed that his personality was formed. He was a very conscientious, hard-working, disciplined human being, and it's suggested that a lot of that came from the imbibed characteristics of army life.
Yeah.
Now, of course, he dedicated his adult life to Irish republicanism, but he had some of the ideas of hard work, dedication.
I suppose his first involvement with radical Irish politics was through na Fianna Éireann, the youth wing of the IRB. How influential was he in this movement?
Well, he was very influential. In fact, he was in many ways probably the driving force behind the Fianna Éireann. He, at an early age, as a teenager in his 14, 15, 16 years of age, he decided very firmly against having a British military career. He was a convinced Irish Republican. But at the time there was a magazine or a newspaper being published by the Fenians. It was the Fenians were behind it, although it was not designed for obvious reasons to keep it legal.
Yeah.
Called Irish Freedom. Bulmer Hobson and others in the Fenian movement were behind it, and he bought a copy of this magazine, this newspaper, and as a result he decided then he would join the movement, and this was about 1911, and he went to the shop of Tom Clark and asked Tom Clark could he join the movement. Now Tom Clark said to him that his best thing to do would be to join the Fianna Éireann and organise and work with the Fianna Éireann, and that was his first. Now at first he was in the Fianna Éireann from 1911, or helped organise in the Dublin area, met some of the leading members of not only the Fianna Éireann but people that had become leading members of the Republican movement, the
IRB,
the IRB.
Irish Volunteers.
It was the year after this, 1912, that he was sworn into the IRB by Con Colbert, one of the 16 dead men who were executed as a result of the rising Con Colbert. But he was inducted into the IRB, and the following year, 1913, he was appointed by the IRB as the national organiser of na Fianna Éireann, and he travelled the length and breadth of Ireland by bicycle with a nominal salary. I mean, it was pennies really, but he lived off the people. He stayed in the houses of the sympathisers. They fed him pretty close.
Which is very common, obviously, of that time, Tommy.
And many years later, same thing, men on the run, on your keeping. It was the supporters and sympathisers that kept and fed and sheltered and clothed Republicans on the run. But he was an inspirational figure. He had a very firm, determined character. Very modest man by all accounts. Never sought the limelight, never sought glory, but very firm, very conscientious, idealistic, and hard-working. And went, as I said, the length and breadth of Ireland to help organise the Fianna. Done a huge amount of work through the Fianna. Now, incidentally, through the Fianna, as it's been pointed out, a lot of the Fianna were young boys newspaper sellers, apprentices in grocery shops and pubs, and naturally inclined towards the trade union movement. So it's well recorded that the Fianna was quite supportive of the trade union movement, and particularly the lockout, 1913 lockout. And in these years, Liam Mellows would have met several of the leading trade unionists, including James Connolly.
Yeah.
And became quite friendly with Connolly.
Connolly had a big impact on his thinking, didn't it?
He did, and Connolly had a high regard for him. Now, he not only met James Connolly, but he would have met Connolly's daughters. And on one occasion, in 1913, 2 members of the IT and GWU were wanted by the police for some action they had taken to support the strike. And Mellows was asked to help organise their escape from Ireland, and he did so. So Mellows, throughout his life, it's quite obvious that he has sympathy and empathy with the working class. It was later to become more articulated in his last months of his life, but certainly he always had an empathy side of the less well-off.
Yes. So Mellows, he took part in the Rising as well. But he quickly rose to the ranks. What was his involvement, Tommy, in the events preceding the 1916 Rising?
Well, you see, he was an organiser with the Fenians.
Yes.
Highly regarded, not only within the Fianna Éireann, but he was a member of the IRB and senior member of the IRB. He'd been tasked with promoting the movement, because keep in mind at the time the IRB was monitoring closely events, not only in Ireland but in Britain as well. But Home Rule was on the cards at the time. And as we know, in 1912 the Home Rule Bill was passed. The Home Rule Bill in 1912 was passed, but it was stalled then with the outbreak of World War I. But the IRB was supportive of the idea of home rule, but determined to push on beyond it, of course. That it wasn't the IRB committed to an Irish Republican Brotherhood, not a nationalist organisation, but willing to take whatever concession would come, but to push on beyond it. But then with 1913 and the rise of the UVF, there was a counter move on nationalist Ireland to form the Irish National Volunteers. Now the IRB had a huge part to play in that, including, of course, Mellows was entrusted with helping to organise the Irish National Volunteers. Now the Irish National Volunteers, because there was at least 100,000 of them. John Redmond, he infiltrated and inserted himself, posed himself on the volunteer movement, which meant that the old Nationalist Party had a huge influence as well. But really, it was the Fenians who had their eye on the Irish Volunteers. Now it came to the outbreak of World War I, and John Redmond, he of course supported the Empire and called on Irish people to support the Empire. The infamous Wooden Bridge speech, where he called for support for British endeavour in the World War. Now the volunteers split. Of the 100,000, only 10,000 stayed with the IRB, refused to go to France. But this was if you like, Mellows played a leading part along with other IRB people in propelling the split and ensuring that there would be some people in Ireland that would stay loyal to the Republic, to Irish independence, rather than fight for the Empire. So about 10,000 volunteers stayed, which is a minority, but it's still
a lot.
Still a lot, but it provided the key figures for the rising of 1916.
Yes. Mellows led Republican forces in Galway during the Rising. Can you tell me more about that?
Well, of course, being at this stage, since he had been promoted into the senior ranks of the IRB and played a very influential part, entrusted with a very influential part in the Irish National Volunteers, which the 10,000 that refused to go to France were effectively IRB, at least IRB supporters now, if not members of the IRB, but IRB inclined towards the IRB. But Liam Mellows was senior IRB himself, and he was entrusted with taking control of the west of Ireland, and there was various attempts made to the British authorities, of course, with their intelligence networks across the island, and monitoring. Mellows would have been well known to them by this stage, very well known to them. And they, of course, they tried to deport him. They did deport him on one occasion for refusing to effectively support the war effort. He was deported to England in the weeks before the Rising. But thanks to James Connolly and his daughter Nora, they managed to smuggle him back into Ireland through Belfast. And he arrived in Galway on Wednesday before the Rising, Spy Wednesday as you would call it. But like at 24 years of age, he took charge of the west of Ireland, and he had a personality again that lent itself to trust. He could be trusted. Although he was still a young man, 24 years of age, he had the personality and the confidence, the bearing,
and the capability.
Now, as we know from history, that with the different countermanding orders and difficulties that happened, the interception of the weapons when Casement was captured and the weapons stopped, that the Rising wasn't as widespread as had been planned or hoped for, and he was waiting to hear from Dublin. But Dublin, after a week, was forced to surrender. Now he was reluctant himself to surrender, but he was prevailed upon. That it would have been a suicidal attempt to confront the rest of the British forces in Galway with what his resources that he had. So he reluctantly issued the order to dump arms and disband, break up. But for a week they had, if you like, defied the King's writ in County Galway. But at that stage, because he was known to have led the rising in Galway and probably would have been executed had he been captured there and then. He was smuggled out of the country and went to the United States. Now, he was actually sent to the United States. Reluctantly he went, but he was dispatched. Interestingly, the senior IRB figure that sent him at that stage to the United States was Mrs. Tom Clark, Kathleen Clark. It's not often acknowledged that with the collapse of the rising in Dublin and the massive roundup there was of known sympathisers, that what actually kept Irish republicanism and the Republican movement together for 2 years at least was the women. And Kathleen Clark it was who dispatched him, told him to go to the States, one for safety and two to help organise and promote the Irish cause among the exiles in the United States, and that's how he went there.
And how was his time in America? Was it without conflict?
It was not without conflict, because Mellows was a convinced anti-imperialist. Now, he had a worldview that didn't easily lend itself to promoting US foreign policy or British foreign policy or global imperialism in any sense. And he saw the First World War as a slaughter, mass slaughter of working people, rather than a justified war by the British or the American United States. So when the United States entered the war, he was critical of it. But because of the nature of the exiles in the States, Clan Gael had been there for a long time, and still would be to an extent the case that Irish Americans had a certain conflict within the Irish American community, whether their first loyalty was to the United States or to Ireland. Now, Mellows had no ambiguity whatsoever. Mellows' first loyalty was to Ireland and an Irish Republic.
So what was his views, Tommy, in the treaty?
Well, now this was when he returned to Ireland in 1920. He after several conflicts with some of the older established characters in the United States, he returned to Ireland in 1920, and he was immediately placed in charge of arms purchases for the IRA. It was now the IRA, although the IRB still remained as an organisation within the IRA, and it wasn't necessarily dual membership. But he was IRB, but he was also IRA, Director of Purchases. He was a convinced, especially having seen what was happening in the United States, the global implications of what the United States could see was rising, coming the new global superpower, and he was concerned with this. So when the treaty came along, he believed that the treaty negotiations, he argued that it was important to at least negotiate or be seen to negotiate with Britain, but not to accept the treaty. He said, for the world public, we have to be seen at least to be willing to talk, but not necessarily to accept what a British settlement. So when he saw what the British were offering, he flatly rejected it. He saw it as what he would have described later in his time in his famous notes from Mountjoy as Ireland just remaining a colony of Britain. Yeah. So on that basis he rejected the treaty. He said there was no need to, and he condemned it wholeheartedly through the treaty debates. He at this stage had been elected as an MP for Galway. Later that had become known as TDs, but he was still an MP for Galway. Took part in the treaty debates, voted against the treaty. But he at that stage had a much wider global internationalist view of politics than purely Irish.
So was he a late convert to socialism?
No, I think that would be a mistake to say that he was a late convert to socialism. Liam Mellows was always, from a youngster, he was always anti-imperialist. He always viewed Britain and imperialism as one of the world's evils, a great evil for humanity. I think it's quite evident from his sympathy and support for the workers during the 1913 lockout and his relationship with the Connolly family, not just James Connolly. One of his closest friends was a member of the Irish Transport and General Union, Workers' Union. There are many connections between Mellows and organised labour. Now, the term socialist can be applied and not applied. We could go around in circles saying whether he was socialist. He was socialist by his deeds and his actions.
Yeah.
So there's no question about that. He could be described as a socialist. In fact, he was supportive of the working class.
So 100 years on from his execution, what can we learn from?
Well, I think we've got to look first at the notes that he wrote, and he effectively endorsed a line taken by Roddy Connolly's newly formed Communist Party of Ireland, and he was laudatory of articles published in the Workers' Republic. That was the publication of the Communist Party of Ireland. Now, it was a small organisation at the time, but remarkably progressive organisation with amazing foresight, describing the new Free State as a tool of imperialism, a colony, that it was going to be ruled and governed by the bourgeoisie, on behalf of the bourgeoisie, and that it was going to be therefore obliged to have an understanding with imperialism and a relationship with Britain that precluded us being independent, precluded us having sovereignty, and therefore the sovereignty that would allow the working class to take measures to defend and protect itself and advance its own cause. So Mellows, and this was what happened with his notes from Mountjoy, that as he was sitting in Mountjoy, some of the, remember he'd been captured after the fall of the Four Courts in June of 1922, and was 6 months in Mountjoy. Now, obviously, there was huge debates going on within the prison and outside how to make headway. Some of the anti-treaty forces were purely militaristic, almost blindly militaristic. But Mellows was anything but, instead of him writing out or talking about military strategies. And he was not opposed to the use of force to defend the Republic, but he could see the need for a distinct policy. And I think this is where several lessons emerge 100 years later. Mellows clearly recognised in his writings and his discussions with others that to win support for the Republic, it was necessary to advocate the policies that would win support for a Republic. That socialism or the Workers' Republic is not something that you can offer as an aspiration. You've got to work for it.
Yeah.
And you have to show day by day its relevance. It's not something to be held out. And I think that was the main thing that he did. He could see what was needed and he could see the value. And I think we're talking now too about the prescience of his analysis and the analysis of the original Communist Party of Ireland that emerged then. So 100 years on, as I think we have discussed here before, we're talking about a new, if you like,
shared, agreed Ireland.
Yes.
Some might say, could that be another form of a counter-revolution, Tommy?
Well, counter-revolution, yes, or it'll certainly not be the revolutionary transformation of power from...
Yeah, not be the Workers' Republic.
It'll not be the Workers' Republic if the trend continues, if the momentum continues towards this agreed, shared Ireland. Now, we're talking about a situation where very recently even the ICTU's General Secretary talked about the distinct possibility of a border poll within the next 10 years.
Yeah.
And I think it's becoming 10 years, 15 years, 20 years. There is a distinct possibility of a border poll and the partition being fundamentally challenged.
Yes.
Now, if we're talking about the life of a people, 10 years is a long time if you're sitting on a thorn. But in terms of the life of a people, 10, 20, 30 years is a very short period of time. So we are looking at a period of time when we can contemplate an end to partition. But unless, and this is where we can draw the lesson from Mellows. Mellows recognised that there had to have been a policy argued, elaborated, discussed, emphasised of the benefits of having a progressive social policy for the people, socialist policy, for a workers' republic. But if we don't do that today, and if we're just content to allow something to emerge called a United Ireland, we'll have a United Ireland where the same people, the same class will be in charge, the bourgeoisie will be in charge, they'll be indebted to imperialism, to capitalism. As a very wise old man one time pointed out to me, for example, in South America, the South American oligarchy owes its position to American imperialism, US imperialism that is, and the US imperialists controlled South America by supporting the South American oligarchy. Now if you take that into Ireland, without the European Union, without their affiliation to the British, without their support for and from the United States, the capitalist bourgeoisie in Ireland today would be isolated. So they depend on imperialism and capitalism for their position, and capitalism and imperialism depends for its influence in Ireland on its support for the Irish bourgeoisie. Now, we can't just simply wish that away. We've got to do the work. The South African Communist Party used to say, socialism is the future, so let's start building it today. And I think that's the thing we have got to, for Republicans that want to see an independent, sovereign Ireland, and to want to see a workers' republic, there's no point waiting until we have a United Ireland, hoping then that by magic there'll be some, if you like, to use a Christian term, some sort of an immaculate conception. It won't happen that way.
It could be like a repeat of 1922.
It could be.
I suppose when British imperialism, when they never left the 26 counties, I suppose they just handed power over to those who govern in their interests.
Well, exactly. As someone said recently at an event to mark the shelling of the Four Courts, instead of Britain ruling Ireland, Britain was ruled for Ireland. Ireland was ruled for, ruled for Britain by the new Free State. And they still do. And we can see them how it's happening today. At the moment, you can imagine how opposed the Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael would be to end a partition, hoping for it to keep partition as long as they possibly can, and employing the newspapers, their media, just as the Free State government used the pro-Free State media in 1922 in an attempt to discredit Mellows by publishing his notes from Mountjoy to raise the Red Scare, of course.
Yeah, right.
But to this very day, we're hearing the Irish Times and the Independent, Sunday Independent, they run an incessant campaign against a progressive New Ireland, a workers' republic.
Yeah, it's concerning when you see like some bourgeois papers like that quoting Irish unity.
Well, of course.
They're already building the words there, Ireland, aren't they?
Well, of course they are, because these people have vast experience of how to manage and manipulate situations. You see, but there's no point, ultimately, as Mellows would have said, and you recognise, there's no point simply criticising the opposition. We've got to, the onus is on us to organise. We're calling for a workers' republic. We can't expect the Irish Independent or the Irish Times or Fine Gael to deliver a workers' republic if we don't.
Definitely not.
And as Irish Republicans committed to an independent, sovereign Ireland with the working class in charge, it's up to us to be absolutely transparent and obvious and open about it. We want, need, and we will work for a workers' republic. We've got to engage within organised labour. We've got to promote the progressive issues. We need to call for housing. We need to call for public housing for all, a national health service for all, education free at the point of entry for all, and not an education service or sector that discourages people through making accommodation for students incredibly expensive. We've got to have care for the elderly. We've got to have all of those issues, and we've got to have fair employment where the means of production, distribution and exchange are in the hands of those who operate within that system. In other words, that the means of production, distribution and exchange are in the hands of the working people, owned by the working people. No privatisation. Those are the issues that we've got to talk about, advocate and organise around, because only within the Workers' Republic can these advantages be achieved. And we've got to, and it's just not a hard sell when you actually sit down and promote it, but we can't shy away from it. And this is something we've got to.
So what advice would you give to young Republicans now, Tommy, that just believe a United Ireland's inevitable?
It may be inevitable, but it's not enough.
Yeah.
We're not nationalists.
No, definitely not.
A United Ireland, let me say this. I used to hear a man called Taylor, John Taylor, Lord Kilclooney, talking about United Ireland. He used to say that we had a United Ireland before 1920. We were within the British Empire, and he'd be very happy with that. You have to keep in mind about United Ireland. We're not nationalists. We're not asking simply for United Ireland. We're asking for an Irish Republic, a Workers' Republic. Now, along the road, we have to remove partition. We have to break the connection with Britain to do that. That's all very well, and there's no equivocation about that. But we're not stopping at just simply removing partition.
Yeah.
It's on to the Republic, and it's on to a Workers' Republic, and nothing else will achieve what the Irish people and its working class need.
Yeah.
Nothing short of a Workers' Republic. And that's when we'll be fit to finally lay the ghost of Liam Mellows to rest and the other martyrs.
Yeah. Thanks for that, Tommy. Very enlightening, as always.
I hope so.